Today we are going to be unpacking standards for content and language. There is a process to follow to do this that helps you think through the critical learning for both content and language that your students need to be successful with these standards. Some important considerations when we are unpacking standards for content and language are looking at key verbs, nouns, and adjectives, not just at the standard at your grade level, but at the standards above and below your current grade level, so that you are able to see how the standard grows and changes over time for students. After looking at these key verbs, nouns, and adjectives, you will want to synthesize what you see in the changes. You also want to think through what students will need to know and what they need to be able to actually do to be successful with the standard. After considering these first three implications, it should become more apparent to you what the dominant language functions are that students need to be successful with the standard, as well as some of the more specific language, the language forms. This might be the parts of speech. This could come out in functional language or sentence frames or key vocabulary that students might need to be successful. Finally, after we unpack our standards, we want to use that information to help us think about our planning and instruction for our students. Let's get started. We're going to use a 5th grade standard from the Common Core English Language Arts. Here's the 5th grade standard. Compare and contrast 2 or more characters, settings, or events in a story or drama, drawing on specific details in the text. For example, how the characters interact. So the first thing we want to consider when looking at this standard are the key nouns and verbs. You'll want to start with your grade level first, which is the 5th grade standard. So if we look at this, compare and contrast would be one of the key verb phrases that students would need to be able to do. Some other key pieces would be drawing on and interact. As we go back to the standard and look at the important nouns, we're looking at characters, setting, events, and specific details. Analyzing the verbs helps us to know more about what students will be doing. Analyzing the nouns helps us to know what they are thinking, writing, or talking about. Once you have gone through the key nouns and verbs for your grade level, which in this case, 5th grade level, you'll want to use the same process to look at the grade level below and above the current standard you're looking at. This helps us really see how the standard changes and grows over time. So if we look at this examples, there are some key differences. In 4th grade, it says describe in depth a character, setting, event, and story or drama, drawing on specific details. So some key verbs in 4th grade are describe and drawing on. Already you can see some similarities and differences there. With 4th grade, it looks like most of the nouns are actually the same. Taking a look at 6th grade, there are some more changes. I'll give you a moment to read the standard and look over the verbs and the nouns that were pulled out. You can pause this screencast at any time to take a longer look at anything that you need. The next consideration to think about when unpacking standards is to take a close look at some of the adjectives in the standard. Just like with nouns and verbs, you want to start with your grade level first. Some key adjectives here that are unique to the grade are listed below. Once you've done that for your grade level, complete the same task for the grade above and below. The adjectives usually help us know specifics of what the students are thinking, writing, or talking about. Once you've looked at nouns, verbs, and adjectives, you'll want to take some time to synthesize those changes and differences you see. If you'd like to take a moment and familiarize yourself with what this teacher pulled out after looking at the 4th, 5th, and 6th grade similar standard, please do that now. I'm just going to highlight some of those key pieces that were synthesized. The teacher noticed that in 4th grade, Students are only really required to describe and to describe one story element. For example, maybe a character. This is different and grows in 5th grade as they are required not only to describe, but they need to be able to compare and contrast characters or other story elements. She notes this important task of knowing the differences between physical traits and personality traits as she thinks about her 5th grade level content, thereby going back to that idea of comparing and contrasting some of those key pieces of story elements. It grows even more in 6th grade. These key differences help us know where students need to come from first and some of that knowledge they need to bring with them, and it also helps us be more strategic with our teaching and targeted. After synthesizing, it'll be helpful for you to think about what students need to know and be able to do. It helps to think about what you just synthesized around the nouns, the verbs, and the adjectives. When you're thinking about what students need to know, you're really thinking about what prior knowledge do they need to bring as they read the text for this standard. What are some basic skills and knowledge that they need, in this case, about literature and narrative structure to be successful? So thinking about some of those key pieces of the standard, students need to have that prior knowledge around story elements: character, setting, plot, problem, solution, and resolution. They need to have some background about character traits, both physical and personality. They need to understand literature text structure, that idea of beginning, middle, end, and how that corresponds with the problem, the climax, and the resolution. And they'll need to have some basic inferring skills. This is all important to know because if we know that our students are not bringing these things already to the standard, these will be important lessons and supports we want to provide to help them be successful with the standard. After thinking about what students need to know, we want to think about what they need to be able to do. So not only with the 4th grade standard or the 5th grade standard, but also with the grade level above and below. So looking at what was synthesized in that initial part, in 5th grade, they're going to need to be able to compare and contrast 2 or more storytelling elements and infer character traits. This is different than what they will need to be able to do in 4th grade, which is to just describe the story elements and infer character traits. It's helpful to identify what students need to be able to do because once again, it helps us to see how each grade level builds on the other. If you have students coming into 5th grade who struggle to describe story elements, you know that you will need to do additional lesson and supports around this piece so that they can be more successful with the more complex ideas of comparing and contrasting story elements. And then further on, students who need a challenge can move into that next standard. The 4th consideration is to then draw out the key language function or functions and forms. You'll notice how the teacher thought through this here. In 4th grade, students are using mainly the language function of describe. In 5th grade, that changes to comparing and contrasting. We do know that in order to compare and contrast, you also do need to describe. But comparing and contrasting is much more complex. Then in 6th grade, the main function moves to cause and effect between events in the story and how characters respond. Noticing these key language functions helps us to provide language supports that are more specific and targeted to what students need to know and be able to do. After figuring out the language function, you'll want to take a look at specific language forms students need. In this case, it might be pulling out that predictable language of the function. Words like while and at first and but and because single those functions of compare and contrast as well as cause and effect. Language forms can take the form of sentence frames. They may also include key vocabulary students will need to be successful with the standard. After you have thought through all of the key content and language that students will need to be successful with the standard, The last step in the process is to think about instructional implications and planning implications. A question you might ask yourself are, what tools do you have to teach this? Or what do you need to gather? What do you know about your students? What do you know about yourself? In this case, the teacher really brought up the idea of using thinking maps. She is familiar with those as well as students. She mentioned some specific types of maps that correspond to the main language functions and topics that students will need to do as part of these standards. She talks about bubble maps for descriptive character traits and double bubbles for compare and contrast, and a cause and effect map. Also, she talks about having those skills and tools already and access to grade level appropriate text that will allow students to do more inferring or less inferring. Also, she notes that she's actually taught all 3 of these grade levels before and already understands some of this progression. She knows that she'll have to work more on cause and effect or inferring skills. So in this piece of consideration, you really think what you know uniquely about yourself and your students and what you will need to plan for, get ready ahead of time, and anticipate. Now it's your turn to give this a try. Start first with your grade level standard, thinking through all of these considerations, and then take a look at the grade level below and above yours. Think about key verbs, nouns, and adjectives. Then synthesize those differences and similarities you see. Then narrow it to what students really need to know and be able to do. Figure out the dominant language functions and the specific language forms students will need to be successful. Finally, think through what will you need to plan, pull from your toolbox, and teach to help your students be successful with this standard.